Hello, Think Liberty listeners. Welcome to episode 6 of Tales from the Shire. Today I have on Richard Manzo, who is actually an elected official from the Libertarian Party. He is on the budget committee of the town of Goffstown here in New Hampshire. He and I went to an open forum of sorts on why people live in New Hampshire and what some of the problems are that are facing New Hampshire. And we actually managed to convince quite a few people of our ways of thinking on one particular issue. And so today, Richard and I wanted to talk about, how to communicate the ideas of libertarianism and how to do it effectively in such a way that you can sway rooms and sway people's minds, because that's the real goal of all of this, right? We want liberty in our lifetimes, and this is the best way to do it. To achieve liberty in our lifetimes, we have to convince people that liberty is what they want. So I hope you enjoy episode 6 of Tales from the Shire. Hello, Richard. Thank you for sitting down with me today. So today, Richard Manzo and myself are going to talk about something that I think libertarians are pretty bad at, which is talking about ideas and spreading the message of liberty. Did you disagree that we're bad at that?
Well, I think for the most part, a lot of libertarians struggle with spreading their ideas without coming off as confrontational or angry.
Yep. So as we're recording this, it's November 2nd, about 3 in the afternoon. And November 2nd, what that means is that it's Halloween here in Manchester, New Hampshire, because the draconian government of Manchester has moved Halloween, has moved trick-or-treating for rain that didn't even happen. But on Monday, October 28th, so 5 days ago now, Richard and myself went to I don't know exactly how you would describe it, but it was a town hall of sorts with an organization called Stay, Work, Play. I don't know if New Hampshire is on the name. I don't know if it's Stay, Work, Play New Hampshire, or just Stay, Work, Play.
It's Stay, Work, Play New Hampshire, I believe. I'm not sure if it's a national thing with state chapters or what, but that's the name of it.
Yeah. But so they put on this town hall where people were supposed to come together and talk about things they liked living here in New Hampshire, things that they didn't like. And the series of talks was called Policy and Pints. So they got you liquored up as sort of a social lubricant to talk to people that you maybe disagree with. The room that Richard and myself walked into was probably, just based off of what everyone else was saying, probably like 85% Democrat or left wing. We recognized all of the politicians that we did recognize, all of the people that we did recognize, we knew were Democrats. Alderman Tom Lopez from Nashua was there, and I've had a couple run-ins with him before, but ended up having a pretty productive conversation with him afterwards. But ultimately, the point that we got to at the end of this discussion with everyone was we almost convinced we basically did convince a room of Democrats that the problem with housing in New Hampshire, the problem with housing costs where we are on the coast, is almost entirely zoning laws, which is incredible, right?
Yeah, I would say so. At first, it was leaning more towards rent control and things like that, trying to make housing more affordable. But of course, eventually we did bring them over to our side in that you can't have affordable housing unless you have housing, and you need to loosen up the zoning laws in order to build new housing.
Okay. So why don't we talk a little bit about what strategies you employed in these conversations to kind of spread the idea that you were trying to push?
Well, I made a lot of references to low-income housing in the sense that you can't really have low-income housing unless you have a lower vacancy rate, which is another major problem in New Hampshire. Is the vacancy rate is just so low, and you can't have a high vacancy rate unless you're building these apartment buildings that many people are looking for to rent, for example. And since you can't build buildings in some places in New Hampshire that are taller than 3 stories, you can't maximize on the real estate that's available. So I went that route.
Right. And so that makes a lot of sense if you're trying to talk to someone who has a fundamentally different opinion of than you when they're talking about rent controls. The obvious solution to get them to where you want them to go maybe isn't to confront the idea that rent controls are a good idea, because we didn't really spend any time on rent controls when we talk to people. It was all pretty much like, okay, yeah, like rent controls are a thing. We don't agree with them, but this is what we think the issue is. And then all of a sudden, you know, people start coming around to that. You could see that it's ideas that they've never heard about. And I guess ultimately what you and I are trying to say here is that being solutionaries instead of just, you know, take the first thing that comes around to you is the correct way to go. I don't know if that's making sense right now.
Yeah, sure. You're not going to get anywhere if your entire philosophy is just force people to keep their prices lower. We don't do it with anything else, so why would it necessarily work for housing?
Okay. So just for a little bit more context, this Policy and Pints thing that Richard and I walked into, it starts with a guy who comes up and he says, you know, why do you want to live here in New Hampshire? Why do you like living here in New Hampshire? And then after people talked for a long time, he said, what do you don't like about living in New Hampshire? What are the struggles here? And one of the struggles that was brought up immediately, I think by me, was housing costs. And like immediately everyone agrees to that one. And then Richard goes and just says draconian zoning laws, and they put that up. And at the end of the session of brainstorming ideas, we all got to vote on what we would talk about. And everyone got 5 votes, and you could put them wherever you wanted. So Richard and I kind of gamed the system after we waited for everyone else to vote, and we saw what it is that we wanted to talk about that no one was talking about, and we just put 10 votes right on draconian zoning laws. So that got to be, I think the New Hampshire Stay Work Play people were very thrown off by that one. They're like, we've never seen this one before at any of these forums.
We were some of the only people who brought up the obvious issue of zoning laws, and where we saw the opportunity to kind of force the discussion on it, since it was essentially star voting. We just threw all our votes down and made it happen.
Yeah. So I guess step one in having a conversation with people who disagree with you and spreading the message is to go where those people are. So I guess find a forum like this, preferably one in real life. The internet seems to be a cesspool where people just argue with each other. And then I guess step 2 is find a way to force the conversation without it being, you know, strong-armed and yelling to whatever subject it is that you want. And for us, we got a little bit lucky. We get star vote and just pick the thing we wanted to talk about. And that forced the conversation at the end back. We got to talk about 4 different things, and I don't remember what they all were, but one of them was housing, one of them was zoning laws, so there was a lot of crossover in 2 of the topics. And so then once we actually got into that conversation, it becomes this interesting kind of balance between challenging bad ideas, presenting good ideas, and I think what Richard and I would both tell people and say what worked successfully for us in the past and particularly on Monday night is that presenting good ideas is far better than putting down bad ideas. because by the end of the night, the ultimate reason that I wanted to do this is because something so amazing happened at the end. There was a man who works for the Manchester Planning Committee. So like my understanding is that for like the entire region of the Merrimack Valley here in New Hampshire, there's a planning commission and they can kind of put certain things together for how cities and towns work together to have their infrastructure work certain ways. And he, at the very end of the discussion, like raises his hands, and I think, well, maybe we should just like get rid of the zoning laws, or just get rid of the zoning laws that are, you know, old world and bad from whatever else. And it was just like, you know, I think we like, that's quite a reach to be able to get someone to go from, you know, I work for the zoning commission, not I work for the zoning commission, but I work for the planning commission, and now I'm ready to, I'm just a step away from, made a Freudian slip to say, let's get rid of the zoning laws. Yeah, I don't know. Were there any thoughts on that?
Well, he raises his hand and he says, zoning laws used to play a role in keeping housing separate from what essentially were big dirty factories. And his whole point was that since you don't really have big dirty factories just sitting in the middle of cities anymore, that it really wasn't a necessary thing. So they kind of came to their own conclusion on that one. I feel like we could have very easily gotten up and talked about how zoning laws have a history of essentially being a racist and classist segregationist system, but we didn't need to do that. They came to it on their own volition.
So I actually had that exact conversation after the seminar got over with Alderman Tom Lopez and the member of the planning committee. And they got to talk about, and I think the guy from the planning committee brought up, he said, yeah, zoning laws used to be super racist in the way they laid everything else. And I'm like, yeah, that's why Compton exists. Like,
yeah, exactly.
Duh. I don't know. I can't remember the name of the documentary. It may have been the 30 for 30 about the Williams sisters and them growing up in Compton, but I might be completely wrong about that. But there have been several documentaries on that. Yeah, it's not hard to look up and say like, hey, what caused Compton to happen? Oh, it was racist white people who didn't want black people living around them. Got it. Like, so, I mean, you look at it and you've got, there's so many things in America today that were formed out of racism. And I got to use that segue from the member of the planning commission talking to me to immediately turn to Tom Lopez, and I get to say, who's an alderman, who's an elected official, and I get to tell him, like, you know, in my opinion, any law that's not 100% necessary is just one more chance for the police to be racist. And I think that's a really important thing to tell every elected official.
Yeah, we certainly don't want to be giving cops more reason to bring their guns to enforce the state's views on people.
Mm-hmm. So to backtrack a little bit, something you said about the one particular member of our group saying that zoning laws were built for factories, and now since we don't have that, you know, they're not necessary anymore. I think there's a lot of things that fall into the, you know, purview of like, this law or regulation was made because of some problem, and now that problem doesn't exist anymore, but we still have that law or regulation. Like if you look at, and I used to do radio in Cleveland, and so the one that would always piss me off was the FCC. And if you look at the FCC, when they were originally made, basically every town had one newspaper they could go to, like one talk, you know, yeah, basically one newspaper to turn to. And the amount of media that you could easily turn on was so limited that they were like, well, we need kids to be able to look at some media, so we should have a law that prevents the one media they can look at from being too lewd for children. But now we live in a society where, I don't know, everyone has hundreds of television channels and hundreds of websites they can go to and whatever else. And you get to the point where you say, well, why does a radio station have to be able to, have to hold to these rules where they can't say fuck on the air? And I think that's another easy conversation to have with people. If you want to get rid of the FCC, it's not like, well, the FCC doesn't do anything and it's my freedom and whatever else. It's like, well, no, you present the reason that it existed, and then you say it's not really necessary anymore. Let's get rid of it. Let's save ourselves some money.
Yeah, sure. There's just so many regulations that now, just due to sheer volume of choice, and not only to mention volume of choice, but also the ability to control what you do see and what you do have to deal with from private companies. Just these regulations don't need to exist. And if we can start chipping away at the machine just by using that point, that's a really great and easy starting point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. So we'll turn back to our guest here today, and I'll just ask, are you having these conversations in your capacity as an elected official in Goffstown?
Well, we talk a lot about we're talking about the value of homes in Goffstown and what they're assessed at, so to say, in terms of developing the tax rate. And we have a very low vacancy rate in Goffstown as well. We're talking maybe 1 or 2 houses for sale at all in the entire town. And we just don't have any, due to zoning laws in Goffstown, we just don't have anywhere that we can build new houses. And we're always talking about it, going back and forth. We need people to move into town, but people move into town, they're going to bring their kids. So maybe it's just a better idea for the tax rate to not have them come in, because then they'll be going through the public schools. And we just have this constant back and forth. And it's like, well, what you need to do is you need to make some space for apartment buildings. We have a perfect building that would work, an old private religious school that no longer is operating, perfect size and spaces inside for apartments, but they just won't change the zone on it.
All right. Well, okay, going further, I guess moving ourselves back a little bit further to the abstract concept of this conversation and having conversations and spreading good ideas instead of, being bad at spreading those ideas. Can you talk about successes that you've had on the Goffstown Budget Committee, like outside of this one event that you and I have been talking about so far?
Yeah, sure. We've had, it's a lot easier with the small things that are very, very easy to frame as unnecessary. We've had, for example, just frivolous luxury quality of life expenses that are in the school district. For example, we had a middle school, essentially commencement ceremony for the middle school kids going to the high school. And I have my personal view that that's not really even a necessary thing to have, but they're renting out space for it. They're renting equipment for it. And it was just like, well, why don't we just use the lower quality equipment that they had at the venue that they were renting instead of renting higher quality equipment, because the kids aren't going to know. They're going to feel special anyway. Yeah. So we can save some money there. We've had programs for, the sports teams that are better left to fundraisers that we've cut. And most of that stuff is due to myself, a couple other libertarians on the committee, and, some principled small government Republicans as well. So
you actually brought over, when you got on the Goffstown Budget Committee, you actually brought over one of the members who was politically independent into the Libertarian Party. Can you talk a little bit how that happened? Because we're actually now at a point where the Goffstown Budget Committee in the state of New Hampshire is 25% LP And I think that's pretty incredible.
Sure, correct. It's a little bit more complicated than that. We have 16 members are entitled to a seat on the committee, but they're all representatives from other commissions. The 12 elected members, 3 of us are libertarians. And I just saw him talking about how frustrated he was with Republicans essentially being hypocritical on the issue of lower spending, lower taxes, and that the Democrats just weren't going to be able to get there with him if he were to join the Democratic Party. So I reached out and said, hey, why don't you join our party, and you can come to our convention and see what it's about. And he did join. He didn't come to the convention. I was a little disappointed about that, but he's now a member of LPNH.
Well, we have another convention coming up.
That's true.
And fiscal inconsistencies. That doesn't sound like Republicans, are we?
Yeah, we might be talking about 2 different Republican parties.
So that's pretty wild. So, yeah, again, it's about approaching people with good ideas instead of confronting bad ideas. If you present alternatives to, whatever it is that they've been suggesting for forever, and whether that thing that they've been suggesting forever be rent controls, or whether that thing they've been suggesting forever be staying in the Republican Party, if you present alternate paths forward, such as, zoning law reforms or joining the Libertarian Party, maybe you can make progress. You got anything else to add at the end here as we're wrapping up?
No, I think we've covered it pretty well. I just really enjoyed the ability that we, presented in practice of being able to convert an entire room of people who, are sort of partway there to going all the way there and just saying, get rid of the bad system instead of trying to, pick away at the little pieces that you might not like.
Yeah. Actually, it was something very interesting at the end there when I was talking to Alderman Lopez. He actually suggested to me, like, why don't you reach out to the mayor and see if you can't get on the zoning board? And I was like, that might happen. Now, I don't think the mayor likes me very much, so we'll see if that happens. I was responsible for bringing just a ton of people to town hall to kill his darling, like, raise the age to purchase tobacco to 21 bill that he wanted passed. And yeah, I spoke out pretty fervently against that. So I don't know if the mayor likes me, but he may have forgotten by now, or maybe that doesn't matter. I don't know. I'll probably reach out and try it. Thanks for listening. Thank you for listening to episode 6 of Tales from the Shire. I hope you guys enjoyed that, and I hope you found it helpful. Again, I think it's really important, the particular issues that Richard and I were talking about today, about, not being confrontational, presenting new ideas in ways that you keep yourselves from entering arguments, and just ultimately talking to people about the things that matter to them and showing them solutions that maybe they haven't thought about before, because that's really what we're offering here in the Liberty Movement, the Libertarian Party, or, whatever liberty organization that you're a part of and whatever kinds of activism that you take part of. And I hope that you gain something out of this podcast today. And I hope that you can take maybe something that you learned here today and use it when you go out and do your own activism. If you did find it valuable, I really hope that you'll consider supporting us at this network. We have a Patreon where you can find us. If you just search Think Liberty, it should come up. We are found on all major social media sites, and you can find us at think-liberty.com. Thank you all very much. And don't forget that Jeffrey Epstein did not kill himself.